When I started to think about my reflection for River Sunday, I thought that I could talk about the environmental aspects of rivers, or I could take a more spiritual tack and talk of rivers as metaphors. Being fond of metaphors, I thought I would concentrate on the second aspect. But as I started to write, what came out definitely tended more towards the environmental. However, I have managed to sneak in a bit of metaphor towards the end. Ko Porangia te maunga, ko Waikato te awa, ko Geeloch te waka, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Edgington te whānau, ko Penny tōku ingoa. This is a Maori form of introduction that stresses relationship to the whenua, the land. Everyone has an ancestral maunga, or mountain, and awa, or river. Strictly speaking, since I was born in Invercargill, my mountain should be Takatimu, and my river Waihopai. But I have no memories of Invercargill. Instead, I grew up next to the mighty Waikato. We crossed over it whenever we went to town. We walked along its banks many times, attended Anzac services next to it, and took my sister's Irish setters to it for exercise and a swim. I remember a class visit to one of the power stations, fishing on Karapiro and Arapuni lakes with my dad, and New Zealand Electricity Department Christmas parties at Karapiro. It is Waikato that I have a relationship to. It is Waikato that comes into my mind when someone says river. In the Maori worldview, rivers and mountains are not seen as things that can be owned, or even as resources to be exploited, but as taonga, to be treasured and protected. The Whanganui River may so far be the only river to be granted personhood, but Māori consider all rivers to be tipuna, ancestors. Whanganui iwi declare, "The great river flows from the mountains to the sea. I am the river is me." Kennedy Warren wrote in a National Geographic article, "Maori values of connectivity to nature, a relational view of the world, an ethic of reciprocity, a sacred regard for the whole of creation. These principles of personhood seem intrinsically right, not to mention desperately necessary to resolve humanity's environmental crises, and many of us want to move toward that way of being." But this is not a new idea, or even a solely Maori one. In 1950, Albert Einstein wrote that the presumption that humans are separate from nature is an optical delusion of consciousness and something of a cultural prison. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. And of course, this fits nicely with Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. God spoke, "Let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature, so they can be responsible for the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the cattle, and yes, earth itself, and every animal that moves on the face of earth." While some Christian churches reject the environmental movement as unbiblical and cling to an outdated interpretation of this verse from Genesis, There have been many Christian environmentalists throughout history, with St. Francis of Assisi perhaps being one of the first. One that I became aware of when I was at college was Gerard Manley Hopkins. Hopkins was a Jesuit priest, a poet, and someone who was passionate about the environment. I studied his poetry in the 7th form and can still remember much of it. He wrote Inversnaid about a brook that flows into Loch Lomond in Scotland. This darksome burn, horseback brown, his roll-rock highroad roaring down, in coop and in comb the fleece of his foam flutes, and low to the lake falls home. A wind-puff bonnet of fawn froth turns and twindles over the broth of a pool so pitch-black, fell frowning, it rounds and rounds despair to drowning. Decked with dew, dappled with dew, are the groins of the braes that the brook treads through, wiry heathpacks, flitches of fern, and the bead bonny ash that sits over the burn. What would the world be, once bereft of wet and of wildness? Let them be left, oh let them be left, wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. In another poem titled Binsey Poplars, Hopkins likens the earth to an eyeball that is so easily damaged. Since country is so tender to touch, her being so slender, that like the sleek and seeing ball, but a prick will make no eye at all, where we, even where we mean to mend her, we end her when we hew or delve. When we recognize both our connection with creation and its fragility, we will protest about companies polluting our waterways, help clear rubbish out of streams, and plant trees to decrease erosion and sediment, wash our cars on the grass, dispose of toxic chemicals safely, use less water, vote for a party that has policies that prioritise environmental protection, donate to environmental charities and to those that help to bring fresh water to the water poor using environment-friendly technologies. I would now like to turn briefly to a more metaphysical view of rivers. When we refer to a river as the Waikato, or the Thames, or the Seine, what exactly is it that bears the name? It can't be the water, because that is always changing. So it must be the riverbed. We could see ourselves as riverbeds filled with God's living water. The verses from John that we heard earlier support this picture. Rivers of living water will brim and spill out of us. However, the riverbed is not merely a container for the water. It is fundamentally changed by it. I will finish by reading an extract from This Is All, the Pillow Book of Cordelia Ken, written by Aidan Chambers. I thought how lovely and how strange a river is. A river is a river, always there, and yet the water flowing through it is never the same water and is never still. It's always changing and is always on the move. And over time, the river itself changes too. It widens and deepens as it rubs and scours, gnaws and kneads, eats and bores its way through the land. Even the greatest rivers, the Nile and the Ganges, the Yangtze and the Mississippi, the Amazon and the great grey-green greasy Limpopo, all set about with fever trees, must have been no more than trickles and flickering streams before they grew into mighty rivers. Are people like that? I wondered. Am I like that? Always me, like the river itself, always flowing, but always different, like the water flowing in the river.